My paper, The Whitlam Legacy, Reflections on Foreign Policy or Affairs, Human Rights and International Law, is in sort of several sections. The first section of it is to actually examine the sort of stylistic shift of Whitlam and his relationship with liberal internationalism as a concept. The second part of the paper is examining the differences between the original form of liberal internationalism and the style of internationalism that came to be deployed during sort of 72, 75, and building on some of those foundations. The final part of the paper explores Whitlam-era commitments to civil, political and economic rights, desire to expand Australian diplomacy in Asia, but it also explores the failure to advance collective security measures through the United Nations for serious breaches of the peace. The paper, perhaps presumptuously, concludes with a few brief reflections on potential lessons of the period that are likely to have utility in the present. The election of the Whitlam Labor government ended 23 years of Conservative rule. The victory is a generational shift, and it's a moment of great change, and it's a range of factors coming together. T.B. Miller assessed the Conservative government in its final phases, perhaps even decaying phases, as not being totally devoid of developments within immigration, defence and international affairs, but it remained very closely associated with the attitudes and policies that had shaped Australia since 1949. In other words, had shaped the Australian Cold War. In terms of those particular policies, the assumptions, and particularly the anti-communist assumptions that had very much dramatically framed Australian policy from the 50s, were by the early 70s becoming less relevant. And in retrospect, we can actually see them unravelling. The UK withdrawal of its military forces east of Suez, the US quagmire in South Vietnam from 1968, particularly after Tet, followed in 1969 by Nixon's Guam Doctrine. These particular areas create an environment where change becomes much more possible, and of course, even looking at those particular assumptions, for example, forward defence, anti-communism, anti-Chinese sentiment, all of these particular things which had framed or dominated political discourse, even this is gradually shifting in this time. Whitlam's ascendancy to the leadership of the ALP in '67 corresponds with these changes, and indeed the world. By the later 60s and early 70s, the Conservative government appeared out of step with not only domestic developments but international developments, while Whitlam's style of leadership articulated a political vision for Australia yearning for change. Whitlam's ascendancy, difficult as it had been, corresponds with the emergence of at least some modernising attitudes within the government and bureaucracy. With the retirement of Sir Robert Menzies in 1966, a key supporter of the White Australia policy and a major obstacle to any significant changes, his successor Harold Holt, while committed in principle to the White Australia policy, moved forward with some degree of liberalisation. There were other developments as well. From the beginning of the 1970s, Indonesia replaced India as the largest recipient of Australian aid. PNG was moved closer to internal self-government. Economic restraints were imposed on capital flows into Australia, and with an exception of a small training team, Special Forces, the Australian military withdrawal from South Vietnam was complete by March 1972. The ALP didn't win the 1969 federal election, but a huge swing against the government in its favour indicated a turning of the tide. Whitlam's contrast to the Conservative government and the timing of his emergence as a truly national political figure should not be attributed to the radicalism of the 1960s period. Whitlam did not identify with the 1960s street protests that had enthralled others on the Australian left, such as Tom Uren or Jim Cairns. For Whitlam and most of his future government, the common influence was likely the Depression, World War II, the electoral defeat of the Chifley government in '49, and the Great Labour Split. Frank Bongiorno suggests Whitlam was not a product of the freewheeling 1960s, and Jenny Hockey concurs that he demonstrated a more connection with the internationalist past rather than 1960s rapture. While foreign policy itself did not play a central role in the 1969 election, Whitlam, as ALP opposition leader, was outspoken and self-assured on such issues. I'd like to now just explore this question of internationalism and exactly what it means. The language and the ideas that Whitlam expressed reflected very deep connections to this concept of liberal internationalism. Christopher Waters and David Lee have identified and closely associate this with the Chifley Labor government from 45 to 49, where Australian foreign policy under Ben Chifley and Dr. Evatt, and as Secretary John Burton, emphasised the importance of the UN, human rights, international law, regional engagement in Asia, and a more assertive relationship with Great Britain and the United States. Whitlam's internationalist principles also reflected personal connections to his father, Frederick, who was closely associated with the UN as a prominent legal advisor on human rights and international law to successive Australian governments, Chifley and also Menzies. After the 1949 federal election, liberal internationalism was soon marginalised by the new priorities of the Australian Cold War. This is a particularly interesting period, and it was a subject of a number of chapters within my PhD, if I go back over the trauma of that. And this particular change within the DEA, within the political areas, was quite significant, and it was something within the DEA itself, for some people who closely identified with this liberal internationalism, was actually quite traumatic, if not professionally detrimental to their prospects. They never quite recovered this ground as the Cold War and power politics and various other things starts to take precedence. After this particular election, liberal internationalism is effectively dismantled. But with Whitlam as opposition leader, it's brought back manifestly into the fold. This was not without innate political risks. The spirit of liberal internationalism itself was, in many ways, a handicap, particularly during this time. And there are a couple of reasons why this was the case. One, the ALP was considered particularly vulnerable upon issues of the American alliance or foreign policy and communism. Two, Dr. Evatt was the champion of liberal internationalism, and as ALP leader, he was also seen as vulnerable on these things. And of course, the social and political history and developments in the 50s made this even more of a practical liability during that time. This tactic of attacking liberal internationalism held tremendous utility, and Sir Robert Menzies and the Conservative government were very expert in actually wielding this particular stick. Whitlam's rhetorical and intellectual linkages with the earlier form of internationalism are striking, yet the context and politics of foreign policy operating by the early 70s, even in the late 60s, were quite different from the period from 45 to 49. Whitlam's greatest policy masterstroke as ALP opposition leader was when he visited China in July 71, breaking over 2 decades of Australian isolation. The McMahon government attempted to utilise the well-worn rhetoric of Cold War anti-communism, which had successfully been used to undermine the ALP on foreign policy and national security for over a decade. It attacked Whitlam and the delegation in terms akin to talking to the enemy or treason, which was often quite a common tactic. While Whitlam's trip was bold and the political risks were real, the international atmosphere was not quite as stark as it had been in the early 50s or even in the early 60s. For example, a private visit to China as part of a peace delegation in 1952 by Dr. John Burton, former Secretary of the DEA, caused political outrage in Australia, destroying Burton's political career within the ALP and tarnishing his political reputation. Whitlam's visit was made at the end of 2 decades of Conservative rule, toward the end, in retrospect of the American ground war in Vietnam, and at a time when Australian government policy on South Vietnam was increasingly being seen as discredited. Unknown to Whitlam, but perhaps suspected by people around, this was also a period where America was establishing the basis for a diplomatic dialogue with the PRC. Only a short time after Whitlam's departure from China, Sino-American negotiations culminated in the announcement by President Nixon that he would visit China the following year. China was one of the core fears promoted by anti-communist Australians since the 1950s, and there were obvious risks that conservative attacks on Whitlam and the ALP could have gained traction. In the words of Bill Hayden, the US announcement recast Whitlam's visit from a political disaster into a stroke of genius. Whitlam's visit came at a time when diplomatic recognition of the PRC proved to be somewhat more politically feasible, and this was done soon after Whitlam won government in 1972. This was a practical engagement between Australia and a major regional power, considered by many as being well overdue. The well-established trading relationship between Australia and the PRC had operated since the 50s, and itself seemed to justify the need for broader recognition. But it had been the politics of the Cold War, particularly US pressure, that had really influenced Australia on the PRC. Australia might have followed the economic and practical concerns of the British, who recognised the PRC in 1950. As Churchill himself explained, not to bestow a compliment, but to secure a convenience. Whitlam's ideas about reframing Australia's regional diplomacy and establishing relations with China, as they had been for others, were considered a practical framework to explore. While this was bold, he ultimately enjoyed circumstances and some political manoeuvre on China not possible for many of his predecessors. I'd like to move on now with some comparisons between the older style of liberal internationalism and Whitlam's style of internationalism, highlighting some of the similarities and differences, also sort of acknowledging some of the political contexts that differ. The Whitlam approach can be usefully considered in two broad categories. The first can be defined almost totally within the liberal internationalist tradition for 2 decades suppressed by the Cold War and anti-communism. In other words, within the 1945-49 tradition framed by Evatt. Here, the Whitlam approach identified itself with civil, political and economic rights, the language of human rights in particular, international law, treaties and various other aspects of that, and the UN as a core component of Australian diplomacy. These were all areas personally and professionally of enduring interest for Gough Whitlam. The second category, also reflecting similar ongoing interest, emphasised Australia's bilateral diplomacy into its own region. This certainly mirrored the need for the expansion of security and trade cooperation, which we can also see in the original period of liberal internationalism, but in contrast placed a lower priority on the use of collective security measures in relation to breaches of the peace available through the UN system. Whitlam's fundamental concern was to modernise Australia's image abroad and establish a new diplomacy, less inhibited by Cold War constraints. Such approaches toward foreign affairs are not uncommon and might be pursued without significant controversy. Indeed, they might be praised as being far-sighted, even enlightened, as in the case of China. Yet controversies can emerge when realism is embraced at the expense of idealism, particularly in areas such as international law and human rights. This is also compounded by the fact that Gough Whitlam gave strong personal emphasis to the language of international law. Any failure to uphold progressive ideals and compromise them on any particularly serious human rights issues in favour of something considered pragmatic would therefore be conspicuous. I think in this particular area also expectation plays a role. Having given this emphasis and having such a genuine empathy and interest in particularly civil, political and economic rights, the expectations and I think also the hopes under Whitlam in this regard were much higher than they had been under predecessors in regards to human rights. The legacy of liberal internationalism was a long-lasting influence, reflecting a genuine empathy towards the key principles of international law and human rights. The rhetoric of Whitlam was reminiscent at times of Dr. Evatt, and the way he approached foreign policy spoke strongly of this connection. But there are distinctions. Evatt's interaction with international law, the UN, universal human rights, were inspirational for Whitlam. This is most significant in areas closely related to civil, political and economic rights. Evatt's liberal internationalism also placed the highest priority on the UN to internationalise breaches of the peace, conflict, and reduce the concept of force or power politics through the Security Council or the General Assembly, where negotiations in accordance with the UN charters could be pursued. This approach was evident when, to the displeasure of the Netherlands, UK and US, the Chifley government referred Dutch aggression in the NEI, Netherlands East Indies, to the UN Security Council in July 30, 1947. Liberal internationalism in the period 45-49 saw the centrality of not only the UN Declaration on Human Rights and international law, but in smaller or middle powers such as Australia making independent use of the collective security functions of the UN to advance peaceful conflict resolution. For Evatt, this was considered a sensible manner to build relations in Asia, frame new parameters within the established alliances with the UK and US, and encourage the internationalise the serious disputes within the UN system. This approach defended the fundamental elements of the UN Charter and demonstrated an Australian willingness to independently refer breaches of the peace to the UN Security Council. This approach provided an avenue for smaller nations such as Australia not to be subsumed by the great powers. It provided an avenue of independent diplomatic action. While warm diplomatic relations were formed with Indonesia because of Australian support for their independence and Australian adherence to the collective security principles of the UN, the Chifley government did not see West Papua in the same light. While most Indonesian nationalists believed the remaining Dutch colony should be part of an independent Indonesia, the Australians saw this issue as another one that could be resolved by UN referral. Liberal internationalism had never been popular with the Menzies-led government, which placed a lesser priority upon the UN. After victory in the 1949 election, Cold War rhetoric and self-interest maintained an Australian role within the UN, but the Menzies government downgraded its early diplomacy and pursued other alternatives. For differing reasons, by the time of Whitlam's ascendancy to the ALP leadership, the party itself was no longer as convinced by the utility of the UN as it had been during the Evatt era. While Whitlam emphasised the role of the UN and the language of internationalism, it would be social, political and economic issues rather than collective security, namely, specifically, breaches of the peace or wars of aggression that would dominate his human rights agenda. There were some minor examples of collective security in relation to Australian mediation on the UN Security Council, or some minor role between Egypt and Israel. However, ALP thinking about international law and human rights were dominated by other concerns. Murray Goot and Rodney Tiffin note the 1950s and 1960s issues such as labour conditions, human rights, racial discrimination, educational and scientific aid, part of Evatt's original vision, received early and strong support from the party. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, decolonisation and opposition to racial discrimination, especially in South Africa, were of particular interest to the Labor Party. The question of racial discrimination within and outside of Australia became closely associated with Whitlam before and after he won office in 1972. The area of racial discrimination held an important place for Whitlam's ambition for presenting a modern and evolving Australia to its own region, and it was clearly an area of personal conviction for Whitlam and others. The lingering issue of white Australia had long proven to be a sensitive issue for Australian diplomacy, particularly in relation to Asia. In 1971, as opposition leader, Whitlam said, "The race question touches us at the most crucial points of our national and international policies. Australia has to be especially scrupulous in its attitudes. Our response in this area of human and international relations will not only determine our place in the world, but perhaps whether we have a place in the world at all. In Australia's race relations, patriotism, enlightenment, self-interest and morality all point in the same direction." Conscious of Australia's unusual history and geography and the history of European domination in Asia, Whitlam was eager to remove any hints of continued imperialism, racial discrimination or white colonialism from Australia's image. This was considered not only important in relation to diplomacy in Asia, but in advancing what became a vigorous opposition to white minority rule in South Africa and Rhodesia. Whitlam considered Australia to be a European nation, but it would be one that would reject on principle racial discrimination with its immigration policies and champion such efforts internationally. This all contributed strongly to the idea of a multicultural Australia, the downgrading of imperial linkages and the ending of entrenched notions of Anglo-Australian racial supremacy. Related approaches would be taken towards Indigenous land rights and self-determination, both of which were considered by Whitlam as long overdue, especially given the inadequate and unjust treatment endured by Australia's First Nations. In power, Whitlam moved quickly to raise the issue of racial discrimination within the UN and at home, to oppose sporting teams from South Africa and Rhodesia from visiting Australia, and to ratify the international covenants on economic, social and cultural rights and on civil and political rights adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1966. These areas would enable the Whitlam government to make its diplomatic presence felt and highlighted a clear point of departure with their conservative predecessors. In a similar vein, even in opposition, Whitlam had closely considered the question of PNG. Through quirks of administrative fate, an early Australian appetite to colonise the Pacific, if not an outright racist attitude to colonise the Pacific, and a League of Nations mandate system after World War I, Australia had gained control of British New Guinea and German Papua. By the early 1970s, PNG was one of the last white colonies to Australia's north, the only other being Portuguese Timor. When Whitlam visited PNG in 1970 and 71 as opposition leader, he proclaimed independence for PNG by 1976. In government, he advanced that timetable by a year. In speaking as opposition leader in Port Moresby, Whitlam said, "All Australians must now realise how damaging and dangerous a reputation Australia's present policies produce. What the world sees about Australia is that we have an Aboriginal population with the highest infant mortality on earth, that we have eagerly supported the most unpopular war in modern times on the grounds that Asia should be a battleground for our freedom, that we support the sale of arms to South Africa, that the whole world believes our immigration policy is based on colour and that we run one of the world's last colonies. We may profess our good intentions and feel that we are victims of special circumstances, but the combination of such policies leans heavily on the world's goodwill and on Australia's credibility." The Whitlam record of ratifying treaties and integrating these principles of international law into Australian foreign and domestic policy, particularly in the areas of environmental, social, economic and cultural rights, is strong. As Michael Kirby highlights, over 133 international treaties entered into force for Australia during this particular time. Kirby concludes that Whitlam was attracted to these areas of international law because he saw such treaties as a potential source of constitutional power for the enactment of federal laws by the Australian Parliament. In the fields of racial, cultural, environmental and economic rights, these areas all reflected the personal convictions of Whitlam and the older style of liberal internationalism espoused by Everett and perhaps passed down through his father Frederick. For example, in the work of UNESCO, this was an area of enduring interest to Whitlam throughout his entire life. In the time of the Whitlam government, there were 3 important treaties dealing with the environment and 5 treaties dealing with nuclear power and weapons. The most significant treaties in relation to foreign policy were therefore connected to the environment and nuclear weapons. The Whitlam government ratified 15 human rights treaties and several conventions of the ILO. On the questions of human rights, perhaps the most famous example illustrating the international and domestic nexus spoken of by Kirby is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1975, enshrined essentially into domestic law by Australia's Racial Discrimination Act in 1975. Whitlam had long argued, quote, "As an island predominantly of European inhabitants situated on the edge of Asia, we cannot afford the stigma of racialism." And this attitude was clear within the approach to economic relations, immigration, Indigenous rights and racial discrimination. I'd like to briefly move on quickly through the case study examining East Timor. And one of the questions within this particular area is, how does this compare with the earlier form of liberal internationalism? I won't retrace back through the entire history of it, but in brief, there's ample documentary evidence to suggest, based on the behaviour of the Indonesian government in 65-66 under Suharto and the Indonesian military in West Papua, including the infamous Act of Free Choice, any assumptions or Indonesian guarantees about the use of force in Portuguese Timor should have been treated with greatest caution. Whitlam certainly referenced the concept of self-determination and warned against force, but he was dismissive of the Timorese independence movement, favouring the idea of Indonesian incorporation. He was a Labour internationalist, but he did not advance the idea of UN oversight or the possibilities of independent Australian collective security measures within the UN in relation to breaches of the peace. This is concerning because there is evidence that the Indonesians took serious note of what the Australian and US attitude on East Portuguese Timor was. This was evident throughout 1974, the clandestine Indonesian destabilisation campaign started in October, and throughout 1975, particularly from August, when Indonesian preparations for the invasion were becoming self-evident. Without the threat of pursuing procedures through the UN in relation to breaches of the peace, the Whitlam approach to Portuguese Timor ignored a core element of the post-World War II international conflict resolution so central to Everett's original liberal internationalism. There were serious opportunities for the Whitlam government from 1974, before the invasion, and in the months leading up to the invasion, to emphasise, even reluctantly to Jakarta, strict Australian adherence to basic international law in relation to breaches of the peace. There were also multiple opportunities for Whitlam, based on these same international principles, to disengage Australia from any of Indonesia's actions. As noted by Michael Kirby, Whitlam's foreign policy on East Timor was seriously flawed, and history demonstrates that the Whitlam government were wrong on this matter. Given the dominion that Whitlam held over the issue of Portuguese Timor, this mistake can't be shared equally with all members of the government. It can also be highlighted that successive governments, Conservative and Labor, continued to pursue policies on East Timor that publicly ignored or downplayed systematic breaches of international law and human rights abuses in favour of good relations with Indonesia. Arguably, the greatest and longest-lasting achievement of this particular approach was not the lessening of human rights abuses in East Timor by so-called sensitive bilateral diplomacy, but was instead the 1989 agreement on Australian-Indonesian oil and gas exploration in the Timor Sea. Here, Canberra negotiated a commercial treaty with an illegal occupying power to exploit the resources of those under occupation, a people who continued to struggle against odds for their legal right under international law to have self-determination. There is much that could be discussed going into greater detail about East Timor, but I think a critical element is that contrast between the original liberal internationalism and this question of the breaches of the peace. Pragmatism proved to be an ongoing attitude towards East Timor for Gough Whitlam even after he left politics, as shown by a personal intervention at the UN defending Indonesian rule in 1982. These attitudes were influential for others within the ALP to agitate for the removal of East Timorese self-determination from the official platform between 1977 and 1985. I'd like to briefly conclude with the idea that while there's a tremendous amount of concern and problems within this regard, Whitlam was not alone on this issue, and those who came after, particularly the Fraser, Hawke and Keating governments, had the opportunities to make different choices on Timor but did not. The Howard government also continued to pursue very similar policies until forced by events within East Timor in 1999 and strong public pressure to reluctantly change course. The paper concludes with some brief observations about foreign policy in the present. In pursuing diplomacy in Timor, not anchored by the strongest commitments to international law and the UN Charter, Whitlam remained certain of his judgments, just as he had been on China. He would refuse to ever admit philosophical contradictions or to concede even a strategic error. This is perhaps a reflection of the complex personality of Whitlam as a politician and political leader, where his personalised approach to policy, including foreign affairs, could dramatically succeed, but also embraced serious elements of risk. In relation to Portuguese Timor, where his record in office and after politics was on the wrong side of history, is seriously disappointing. In contrast, when pursuing diplomacy anchored strongly by the language of human rights and specifically framed within areas of international law such as civil, political and economic rights, Whitlam acted quite prophet-like in his foreign policy approach and the vision he outlined. In these areas, Whitlam expressed with conviction a vision for Australia which resurrected many of the dormant aspirations of internationalism. The brief reflection offered in this paper, inadequate though it is for such an area of expansive scope, also suggests some modest lessons for our own uncertain present, namely the practical necessity for Australia to uphold its international obligations, particularly in the realm of international law and human rights, even when this can be embarrassing to ourselves or may create issues with allies or other important nations. In the Trump era, where even the pretense of acknowledging international law is openly diminishing, Australia, like others, can take the opportunity to seek short-term advantages through policies that will either undermine the letter or the spirit of international law, or it can choose to embrace the style of committed internationalism that truly upholds international law and human rights as the fundamental building blocks of Australian security and international peace. We cannot have it both ways. In the longer term, the most ethical and practical manner to pursue Australian national interests remains through adherence and indeed independent advocacy for the existing instruments of international law. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam, both for your dedicated research on the topic and for summarising it so eloquently today. Let me say a couple of things before we break to get a sandwich. I guess the first thing I wanted to say is why the Whitlam Institute was interested in Adam's topic when he put it forward for the fellowship. And that goes to what we're here to do as an institute. Many of you will know that when Gough Whitlam established the institute, part of what he wanted us to do was to contribute to the great and continuing work, in his words, of creating a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. This work comes for me very much under that, an independent Australia confident in its own identity. So we do a lot of things at the Institute, from community engagement to civics education for young people, but what we're focused on today is around the policy work that we're aiming to do going forward. We've made a strategic decision to focus our policy work under two particular themes going forward for the next few years. The first will be the future of Australian democracy, and the second thematic area is Australia in the world. So under that space, we're looking to broaden out the conversation about how Australia engages with the world beyond bilateral diplomacy, beyond security issues, but the many ways we engage and the different ways we're perceived as a country around the world. So this is really one of the first pieces of research we've been able to do under that heading, and we're very grateful for it. I have asked our team to include with your papers the Kirby lecture that Adam references in his paper and mentioned today. For me personally, it's one of the best examples of a really comprehensive view around Whitlam and international law and international cooperation. It makes a very strong case for all of the incredible things the Whitlam government achieved, from the number of treaties to how we engage with the UN, but it also puts a lens on some of the failings of the government during that period and Whitlam himself. So I hope you take a chance to read that when you have time. The focus for today, I really want to make sure that we're all clear, is that everyone around this table has a voice to be heard around this topic. But I would really ask that, although we expect a very challenging conversation, we'd really like it to be a respectful debate where everyone's voices are heard. So we're going to focus in the next couple of sessions on the aspects of the Whitlam legacy related to international law broadly, international human rights law and its application in Australia and domestic law, and the conduct of foreign policy globally, but particularly in this region. What we want to do as an institute is look at what lessons we can learn from this period of history and this approach to policy, and what relevance we can demonstrate for policymakers today in the field of foreign policy and international relations. You'll note that there was a slight change to your program. We had hoped to have a responder to Adam's paper from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the First Assistant Secretary for International Law, but that ended up not being possible. So we're not going to put all of that responsibility on you, I assure you. But we had hoped for that to get some policy traction around this topic, but we'll make sure that we follow up on today's discussion. So aside from that change, we'll grab some lunch now. The sandwiches will come in, and we invite you to take what you like and come and sit back down at the table. We've got about 15 minutes to do that. And then we'll have panellists deliver some comments on their own papers. So first Frank, then James, then Roderick, and then David. And then we'll have a cup of tea, and we've got about an hour after that for a very open conversation for everyone around the table. So we really look forward to hearing what you have to say.